11 posed a crisis to this sacrificial system of innocent domination in at least 3 ways. First, as historian of religions Bruce Lincoln has shown, the terrorists themselves were, quite vividly, sacrificing themselves. They exaggerated in postmodern hyperrealism and technological banality exactly the conjunction of innocent domination or blessed brutality that Americans like to claim as our own. They claimed that their religion justified their violence, just as Americans like to claim that our piety produces our power. Secondly, the targets chosen by the terrorists were only innocent if one was willing to do some very fancy maneuvering. The World Trade Center and the Pentagon obviously represented concentrated U.S. wealth and military power, respectively. To put it mildly, these institutions have not always been received as benign on the global stage, especially since Vietnam. And while it might be accurate to say that the individuals at both places were innocents in the sense that they weren't literally combatants, many people around the globe would recognize both the World Trade Center and the Pentagon as sacred symbols or even sacred places in a clash of civilizations, as Samuel L. Huntington from Harvard famously put it. And it was into the symbols of one side in this clash that the iconoclastic fury of those inspired by the illegitimate fatwa of Osama bin Laden quite literally crashed. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it was not at all clear that this was a war Americans could win through traditional military means of sacrifice. Time and again, critics of the policies in Iraq and Afghanistan have lamented that the sacrifices to support these wars have not been shared, but have been disproportionately borne by those in the U.S. military. I generally agree with this assessment, yet I also find this call for shared sacrifice largely hollow, since it has not led to higher taxes or other obligations for even the richest among us. Instead, I suspect that underneath this anxiety about shared sacrifice lurks a dim awareness that if this really is a clash between civilizational systems of sacrifice, ours might quite likely lose. Part 2, Hope for Traditions in America. Given the above, is there any chance to recover the prospects that existed immediately post 9/11 to mobilize religious and secular agents against religious violence and on behalf of peace? In fact, I believe we could witness consensus emerging across traditions along the following lines. I can only sketch that consensus here, but it runs from Mohandas Gandhi in India, to Diane Nash in Birmingham, to Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam, to Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, to Anna Walentinowicz in Poland, to Lima Gaboe in Liberia, to Fethullah Gulen in Turkey. It is the single least known story in the 20th century history of religions. The consistent, pragmatic application of the principles of nonviolent resistance to effective social change. Religious peace builders have been effective agents of nonviolent social change in context after context across traditions, including here in the United States, not only in the civil rights movement, but also in the first wave of feminism and the successful struggle for women's suffrage, and in the agitation for changes in child labor laws during the progressive movement. Organizing interreligious and ecumenical agencies on behalf of a more just and peaceful world is the untold story of the history of religions in the 20th century. And the growth of religious peace building can be, note well the conditional, the most significant story in the history of religions in the 21st century. Basically, religiously engaged nonviolence or peace building seeks to build a society that is no more utopian than a society based upon trust. Such a society seeks to enhance and sustain life more than it seeks to destroy or harm it, backed up as necessary by means to hold people accountable when trust is broken. In fact, this social capital or cultural power of trust is the most vital component of any religious tradition. Trust marks the daily interactions between religious believers who count on each other to mean what they say, and insofar as possible, to say what they mean. It is the scandal of religions when trust is broken, but this only highlights how fundamentally trust is woven into the fabric of religious communities. As I put it in Empire of Sacrifice, religions exist to end violence, insofar as possible. Religions exist to end violence, insofar as possible. In practice, Religious agents build trust through the application of what I call the 5 peace principles. First is literacy, broadly understood. People of faith, like those inspired by the Muslim Imam Fethullah Gulen, build and support schools. They teach self-critical learning. They welcome insights from all disciplines, and they are learned in their own sacred texts and teachings, what Gandhi called satyagraha, truth force. Second peace principle is what I called practiced means, that is, people of faith build peace by practicing the rituals that promote peace within their discrete communities. Third peace principle is what I call inelegantly interdependent sociability, or more simply, but less accurately, empathy. Religions foster the capacity to recognize. Fourth peace principle is what I call grounded pluralism. Finally, religions promote peace through organizing. It's currently fashionable for many to shy away from institutional religion. But an uninstitutional spirituality is also a disorganized religion, liable to manipulation by demagogues or liable to forgetting in the face of inconvenience. Only regular community life, real human interaction, can foster the accountability to trust that is the glue of any society we would want to live in.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and this has been such a fascinating panel so far. I really have enjoyed everything said, and what I'm going to talk about kind of dovetails very well with the 2 panelists that came before me, because what I'm going to talk about is stories and the importance of stories. We need stories. They are part of our psychology. We dream in stories. Our religion is based in stories. I mean, if you took any of the faiths and boiled them down just to a couple, what the basic idea or rules are, all the great religious people say it always boils down to the golden rule, do unto others or do not do unto others, however it's stated. And yet, we require these stories of Noah and Adam and Moses and Jesus and Muhammad and stories of people from other faiths to understand them, and that's what we relate to. So, stories are the most powerful force in humanity, most powerful force in the world. Ms. Cosby might have been, and I'm happy to hear that you were one of the first journalists to mention Al-Qaeda and all of that, but when I turned on the TV that morning, the first 2 potential perpetrators that I heard a shocked television anchor opine might be behind these attacks were the Serbs and the Iraqis. The Serbs, because you may remember we had just fought a war in Serbia. The Iraqis, because of obvious reasons. And I wonder if it had turned out to be the Serbs or the Iraqis, would we even have a panel like we're having today? If it had been the Serbs that had been behind us, would people be talking about what's wrong with Orthodox Christianity? Would we be looking at, the Balkans as a place of a hotbed of violence and terrorism? Would we be having to have Orthodox Christian leaders over and over repeat, we are not responsible for the acts of those few. They did not represent what we do. I don't think so. If it had been Iraqis that had been behind it, well, there'd have been a state actor. Well, we actually did invade Iraq anyway. But that probably would have happened. But the focus would have been on a national, we would have had a bad guy, a regime, and Islam would not have been a part of the conversation, particularly since Saddam Hussein was a secular figure. Before 9/11 even happened, there was a prevailing storyline about Muslims being backward, being fanatical, particularly Arab Muslims. And so the event happened, and this idea of a religious battle, a clash of civilizations, they hate us for our freedoms, it's about Muslims, so on and so forth, became the overarching meta-story arc that we've been living with for the last 10 years. And which has had not just an impact, we're here today, we're talking about Islamophobia, but that's really a smallest part of all of this. I mean, if we think of the wars, if we think of the number of people who have been killed and displaced. MIT, Harvard did a study a year or so ago, measuring in your brain the impact that these sort of storylines and story arcs have on you. And found that storylines that emphasize violence against your perceived group.
We now move on sort of to the next stage. I think this is great, the timing of this. and for this to be the next panel discussion, which I hope will be equally as interesting. It'll be a tough act to follow with the three of us, but I'm sure these guys can do it. The topic is the worldwide repercussions of incitement to hatred and to violence.
The first narrative of fear is that growing belief among native populations that Islam was somehow allowed to flourish unchecked in the post-war period, that Muslim leaders aimed to impose an Islamic order. And we had a glimpse of this during last summer's debate over an Islamic center downtown, of course. Now, against that narrative is a dim view that is held by many Muslims, I think, that European governments and Western governments are generally repressive and intolerant of diversity. Now, in this account, which is similarly pessimistic, and more importantly, they miss the broader trend of what is actually happening on the ground. And this audience is, I think, evidence of this. That Westerners and Western Muslims have been successfully negotiating with one another and adapting to one another over the past 10 years. And if we want to really grasp the impact of 9/11, then all we have to do is look back a few years before the terrorist attacks and see how far this institutional integration has progressed. When I began my fieldwork in the late 90s in Germany and France and Italy, state-mosque relations didn't even exist. And that's because the religious practices of Muslims were still being filed under foreign affairs. So as recently as just a decade or more ago, Islam remained basically unknown as a domestic policy issue to European politicians and administrators. And so when I went around to do my interviews, I wound up being sent to the Foreign Affairs Ministry or to immigration authorities. And this was not only on the part of the European states, but also within the Muslim communities themselves, because they too remained quite attached to consular networks or foreign political parties. And so local and national authorities did not yet have the quality of institutional contacts, and Islam's foreignness became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But more interestingly, and in my mind more hopefully, that same free space that created new vulnerabilities also opened up new possibilities for genuine adaptation and the westernization of Islamic practices, with very important implications for the development of religion elsewhere. Space has been created for the continued interpretation of Islamic jurisprudence, but not just on issues like mortgages or divorce, but a whole new caste of prayer leaders and imams is taking shape and becoming acquainted with other systems of state-religion relations, other cultural norms, European languages, mixing with local societies, including Muslims of all backgrounds, but also non-Muslims. And the Gulen movement is evidence of